So hello everyone, the second week of the Nod-Krai beta cycle has started, introducing a very important update to the core Nod-Krai mechanic, along with various kit changes to Aino, Flins, and Lauma. So I wanted to go over all the significant changes made and analyze their impact on the 6.0 characters. Before we discuss the big changes, let's quickly go over the direct changes made to the character kits for Aino, Flins, and Lauma. For Aino, her kit received one small buff to her C1. Along with increasing her own elemental mastery by 80 after using her skill or burst, she now gives that same buff to the active character. This seems like a pretty negligible buff, but it's actually quite nice for Aino. Before, her only buff in her kit was her C6, which would have been inaccessible for most people unless you plan on pulling a lot on her banner. So adding an additional EM buff to her C1, which is much more accessible to most players, is great and improves Aino's support performance in her relevant teams, which are lunar reaction based and appreciate the EM. Next, Flins' kit received two main changes. First, his standard burst got a pretty big nerf, increasing its cooldown and burst cost while decreasing its damage. This sounds bad, but remember that Flins doesn't actually use his normal burst in normal gameplay, so this nerf is actually completely irrelevant to his performance. I assume HOYOverse did this to really make sure that you play Flins the proper way, which is to use his special burst instead. The second change of his kit was a buff to his C6. Nice, I guess, for those planning to whale. Finally, Lauma's kit got four main changes that are overall positive. First, in her A4 passive, the damage percent buff based on her EM doesn't just buff her off-field Dendro hits, but to her elemental skill now. I'm not actually sure if this means her entire skill, including the off-field Dendro app, or just her skill damage, and it's likely that it's just regular damage percent, so it doesn't even buff the lunar bloom damage of her hold skill. So it is a little bit unclear, but also not that important of a change in general. Second, her burst was buffed. The EM scaling of Lauma's quill buffs to bloom related reactions was increased, with lunar bloom specifically getting a much larger buff. While the lunar bloom buff only affects Lauma's holdy and C6 damage in 6.0, this is preparing Lauma to be a very strong buffer for a lunar bloom focused DPS. In a similar fashion, her C2 was buffed to give a larger damage increase to lunar bloom specifically. Lastly, her C6 lunar bloom damage was nerfed fairly significantly, which does suck for the whales but doesn't really affect the majority of players. With the character kits out of the way, let's delve into the updates made to Moonsign, the unique mechanic of Nod-Krai. To quickly summarize the system, your party has a different Moonsign depending on the number of Nod-Krai characters you have in the party. One Nod-Krai character means the party has a Nascent Gleam Moonsign, and two Nod-Krai characters means the party has an Ascendant Gleam Moonsign. The level of Moonsign determines and enables certain buffs from the Nod-Krai artifact sets, weapons, and character talent abilities. Now in the original description, it said that Nascent and Ascendant Gleam bonuses stack unless explicitly stated, which implied that with two Nod-Krai characters, you can get both bonuses from Nascent Gleam and Ascendant Gleam. However, we now have clarification that none of these bonuses actually stack, and it seems to be intended. For example, for the new 4-piece Nod-Krai artifact sets, if you have one Nod-Krai character, the DPS set gives 15% crit rate, and the support set gives a 60 EM buff. With two Nod-Krai characters, the DPS set gives 30% crit rate, and the support set gives a 120 EM buff. With two Nod-Krai characters, the stats aren't added, you only get one or the other. Also, we got confirmation that the team-wide lunar reaction buff doesn't stack as well. Having one of each set on the team gives 20% lunar reaction damage bonus in total, not 40%. This was already generally assumed, but what was surprising is that this also applies for Lauma's A1 passive. With just herself as the only Nod-Krai character on the team, she allows bloom related reactions to crit. If you pair her with another Nod-Krai character, you lose the crit on bloom reactions but get lunar bloom crit instead, which currently only applies to Lauma's hold skill and C6 damage. This was how it apparently worked in the beta server already, but most people, including me, assumed it was a bug. But now that it doesn't seem to be like a bug unless they change it again, what does this mean for Lauma? Lauma is still a very strong Dendro support, but she is now the one character in 6.0 that doesn't 100% need to have two Nod-Krai characters on her team. Her alone means the party's bloom related reactions can crit, which is arguably the most important buff she provides. If you had Aino as a party member in a newly bloom team for instance, you won't get the critting bloom reactions anymore. But this doesn't mean that Lauma only wants to be played as the only Nod-Krai character. With two Nod-Krai characters, even though you lose the bloom reactions critting, you gain the full buzz from the Nod-Krai artifact sets, weapons if you're using them, and increase her own personal damage with the lunar bloom buff, making both types of Lauma teams fairly close in performance. Thus, in contrast to Flins, whose teams necessitate two Nod-Krai characters, Lauma can choose, with both having their pros and cons. But on top of this important clarification, HOYOverse made one major addition to the Moonsign system. The version 2 beta introduced a completely new buff mechanic when you have two Nod-Krai characters in the party, which people are calling the Nod-Krai resonance. When your non-Nod-Krai characters use their skills or bursts, they will grant a team-wide buff to lunar reaction damage up to a max of 48%. And this buff scales on their stats depending on that character's element. For Pyro, Electro, and Cryo, it's based on attack. For Hydro, it's based on HP. For Geo, it's based on defense. And for Anemo and Dendro, it's based on elemental mastery. So for example, in a team with Flins, Anefa, Yelan, and Sucrose, Yelan and Sucrose are the two non-Nod-Krai characters. When they use their skills or bursts, they will grant the team a lunar reaction damage buff based on their stats. And since Flins and Anefa deal majority lunar charge damage, this is very helpful for them. If Yelan has 30,000 HP, she gives 24% lunar reaction damage bonus. If Sucrose has 1000 EM, she gives 30%. If you add them together, you get over the max buff of 48%, so you get 48% lunar reaction damage bonus. Now if you have Aino on the team instead of Yelan, only Sucrose is able to enable this new buff, so you just get 30% lunar reaction damage bonus. Here are the necessary stat values needed in order to reach the max team lunar reaction damage bonus. Now unless you're Nilou who can reach 60,000 HP by herself, you generally need 2 non-Nod-Krai characters to get the max buff. Overall, I actually like this new addition to the existing Nod-Krai mechanic. Yes, it still incentivizes the 2 Nod-Krai character team building, but it also incentivizes using older non-Nod-Krai characters as well. It makes it so that the Nod-Krai meta isn't looking to just be use all Nod-Krai characters together, since you get value for mixing in characters from other nations. Thematically, this also makes sense since Nod-Krai is looking to be a mix of all the other regions we visited. And with characters like Duran and Varka who are likely just considered Mondstadt characters, this new Nod-Krai resonance is a good way of incorporating them into the Nod-Krai lineup. In most cases, the only way you get the 48% lunar reaction damage buff is with 2 Nod-Krai characters and 2 non-Nod-Krai characters. But this doesn't mean that all Nod-Krai teams must be restricted to this team building formula. In a Flins team, you can play 3 Nod-Krai characters and still be fine. Sure, you get a lower damage buff from the Nod-Krai resonance, but you can just get more damage if the 3rd Nod-Krai character is a strong support like C6 Aino. And in Lauma teams, sure, she wants to be the solo Nod-Krai character if she's played as a generic Dendro support to allow bloom related reactions to crit, thus not having the new resonance. But that's also just still fine. She doesn't need to have the lunar damage bonus to be a strong Dendro support. It's just a part of the trade-off of her kit. Ultimately, it's just a nice free damage buff to lunar based teams. So what do all these new changes and clarifications mean for the performance of the 6.0 characters? In my most recent video I made about Lauma, I showed some early calculations done by Theorycrafter Vomfi. He has since updated all his calcs and done more calcs on his stream, so if you're interested in more detailed TC, I highly recommend checking out his Twitch channel or following him on Twitter. He has done a lot of teams, but I'll just show a few in this video comparing to his older calcs to highlight the impact of the changes made in the second week of beta. All of Flins' teams pretty much got a buff because the Nod-Krai resonance gives a free damage increase to lunar charge, along with a new EM buff from Aino if you're using her. Now, his best teams are reaching about 100 to 110k DPS compared to around the 90 to 100k DPS range previously. Lauma Bloom is a bit more nuanced. With her passive not stacking anymore, you have to choose between Bloom's critting or increasing her personal damage by adding in Aino as a second Nod-Krai character. The solo Nod-Krai team looks to be the better one at the moment, but both are still solid. And in existing teams that already have 2 Nod-Krai characters for Lauma's personal damage, the Lunar Bloom damage buff from the Nod-Krai resonance and the Lauma kit buff simply gives these teams an improvement. Overall, every 6.0 character is looking to be good at the moment, but of course, everything is still in beta, so very subject to change. And with how crazy the changes have been already, there's likely more to come in the upcoming weeks. If you want to continue to keep up to date with the beta changes, I highly recommend subbing to the channel for the latest beta news with TC influence analysis, as well as character guides once beta is over. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or like the video if you enjoyed. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.